Well, hello and welcome to Circus History Live. I'm president of the Circus Historical Society, Bruce Hawley. Circus History Live is presented monthly by the CHS. Recordings of previous broadcasts are on the Circus Historical Society YouTube channel. Tonight, our special guest is 1944 Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus Fire survivor, Nancy Savin. And now here's the host of Circus History Live, CHS Vice President Chris Berry. Chris?
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for joining us, Nancy. It was 80 years ago this month that the city of Hartford, Connecticut really became inextricably linked to Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. Nancy Savin was one of those who was actually in the audience on July the 6th, 1944, when the big top caught fire. And there aren't a lot of survivors left today, so we appreciate the fact that you've joined us, Nancy, to share your story with us today. You're coming to us from New York City, but you're a longtime resident of Connecticut. So tell us a little bit about growing up in Hartford in the 1940s.
Okay, well, first of all, before I do that, I want to thank Bruce Hawley for inviting me tonight. And I want to thank you, Chris, for our ensuing discussion, which I know people will enjoy. And I know I will enjoy it. I hope you will as well. And I also want to give a shout out to Cherry Stout, because it was she who put me in touch with Bruce when I had emailed on Circus Fans of America, hey, I'm a survivor of the Hartford Circus fire and I have a few questions and so forth. And she sort of got back to me, and that's how everything has started. So your question as to what it was like in Hartford, well, when I was 6 years old, I moved to West Hartford right after I was turned 6. But I can remember that in sort of a wartime footing, insofar as I remember our air raid shades on the windows because you wanted to block light so that the German planes coming to bomb Pratt & Whitney, please, we didn't want that to happen, but if they decided to do that, we had to be prepared. So I remember the ambiance of being in a wartime as much as a 6-year-old can. And then I have told you that when I was 5, there was a WTIC radio program called Gene and Glenn Show. I think it was sort of I don't know what it was. I've tried to find online. It was sort of a review or a vaudevillian show. And I was invited, I think my mother probably helped this, to sing the Marine hymn from the halls of Monte to the shores of Tripoli. And I sang it on WTIC as a patriotic 6-year-old person. And I got $5 silver and a beautiful doll. So, and then I also remember in our school in Hartford, I went to the Rawson School before we moved to West Hartford. We went in the basement of this old school and we would huddle all our backs against the wall in a line because we were practicing what we would do in case there was a bombing. And we also had small containers of what at that point was like totally unheard of, dried food in a little package. No one had dried food, but we had that in case, we no longer could get fresh food. So I have these little tiny memories of what it was like to be in the wartime. And I also remember when the war ended, how we celebrated. I remember also opening the door in West Hartford and seeing the Hartford Times on the doorstep when Roosevelt died. That I somehow remember. So those are my wartime memories.
Well, in 1944 and earlier, 1943, 42, the circuses that were traveling around the country were seen sort of as morale builders. And that was one of the reasons why, even though there was rationing of things like gasoline and rubber and stuff like that, the circuses were still able to come to town. In early July 1944, which was 80 years ago now, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus rolled into Hartford on the 5th of July. They were late getting in, which was not unusual at that time for the circus. They didn't do a performance on the 5th. They did do one on the 6th. And then on the 7th was the day of the matinee. And you went to the circus that day. Tell me what you
wasn't first... the 7th. I'm sorry. So they didn't do their Wednesday performance, but they did Thursday. That was the 6th.
On the 6th, yes. So there was no matinee on the 5th. There was an evening performance that night.
And
And
it had
then
gone very well, right? And
yeah, and then the next day, which was the July the 6th, was when you went to the circus. Now, what are your recollections of that day? I know you were only 6 years old.
right. Well, as I said, we were in the New London area, and I unfortunately cannot remember whether we took a bus in, whether my aunt drove, I don't know. But my older brother Mitchell, oh, and my aunt Edith Savin from New London and her two children, and her another nephew of hers, drove into Hartford, got into Hartford, and I have no recollection of getting there. I have a definite photograph in my mind of being on the bleachers. Now, I should tell you that we were in the general admission, which I think was $1.20 a ticket. It wasn't where the majority of people were. The majority of people, and I'm sure you'll show the map a little bit later on, to show where people could sit in chairs, folding chairs. That was more elegant and more expensive. We were just on the bleachers in the general admission section, and I think we're sort of halfway. I'm not sure, but all I know is that I do remember at one point we were all watching, and I have this essay that I wrote like 3 or 4 years later as a child. I saw bears and lions, and at one point I thought everyone was standing up and looking to the right because they were anticipating the flying Wallendas were about to commence their acrobatic show. But that isn't what they were all looking at. They're all looking at a circle of fire on the tent. And then at that moment, somebody screamed fire. And my aunt had the presence of mind. I don't know how she could do this, because you would think, and everyone else thought, many people thought, sadly, that you would go out the way you came in. You'd walk down to the bottom right of the bleachers and go out the entrances. She, however, had the forethought to take my hand and everyone, and we went up to the top of the bleachers. Chris, I have read that it was 15 feet, it was 14 feet, it was 12 feet. I have no idea. But what happened was that there were ropes and there were poles. Some of my family went down on a pole. She jumped, apparently in her high heels, according to my little essay. And I grabbed onto a rope. I mean, I would never grab onto a rope 15 feet because I was smaller, and what else was I to do? And I slid down the rope. I had, I don't know whether they were severe, I have no idea, but rope burns from that. And some big, nice guy caught me. And I don't know who he was. I'm eternally grateful to him. And so my brother and my cousins all came down, except for one of my relatives, the nephew, refused to go down to the pole and he was eventually, as I wrote down, pushed. He hurt his spine, and the rest of his life he had trouble, with his spine. But we escaped. And then once we were outside, I do remember walking along, seeing everyone streaming around. One young woman in particular, her face was just total terror. She was lost. She didn't know where people were. She was totally afraid. Another man was carrying a child, possibly a burned child. And then we made our way to somebody's house. I have no idea whose house it was. And we were able to call my father, and he was working in East Hartford, and he eventually came. And I remember I whistled to get his attention, because that was our magic, our special, way of communicating when we couldn't really communicate it in front of each other. And he picked us up, and we left. And that was, so it wasn't as horrible as as I say. So many people really were totally traumatized. so many people were horrifically burned. You know, the very fabric of the tent that was burning, and it would fall on people's skin. I mean, it's just horrendous what happened. And I very, very, very fortunately, gratefully, didn't experience any of that.
So when you think back on that summer day, obviously, you're 6 years old, you have very, very vivid memories of what you saw that day. Um, was that something that you talked about with your family? Was that something that the kids at school talked about?
Well, it wasn't. It's just I can't explain that, because if you were to have that kind of a trauma today, right, you would have counselors coming in, you would have family um, guidance, and but I can't explain why. I don't know whether it was generally done because it was so traumatic for the city. God knows the city reeled, right, from this horrendous event. You know, the Ringling brothers was not even required to have a fire inspection to say how many fire extinguishers, where was the water source, what would you do in case of fire, fire signs that would say exit here. There was none of that. And I can't say fortunately, after the whole thing was over, they changed the charter of the city of Hartford, and they unified the fire department, the police department, the building department. So that if it served any purpose at all, I don't think it did, but it
And,
made them.
and what Nancy is referring to there is that there was a building permit, but there really wasn't the same level of fire marshals coming out and things like that there were even in other cities at the time. But to your point, Nancy, we found that in Connecticut, and anyone who traveled with a tenant circus in Connecticut anytime after 1944 learned that the rules were very, very serious. There were fire trucks at the tents. There were even when they were no longer canvas, and there were certain number of firemen that had to be on site and so forth. So it was something that it's very unfortunate that it happened, but it did sort of change the regulations when it came to having a circus like that. So we talked a little bit about this whole feeling of you know how the city reacted. I'm sure that there were people that you came in contact with, either through your family or whatnot, who did have
Yeah,
a more tragic story to tell.
that was absolutely correct. I'm going to cry. My piano teacher was this marvelous, wonderful, kind man. His name was Samuel Gorski. Was a taught at the Hartford School of Music on Asylum Avenue. I took dancing there and I took piano lessons when I was 6. So I had started probably the fall, of that before. And he apparently lost his only child. He and his wife had one child
Hmm.
who died in the fire, and then and their cousin, I guess, who was there as with them, died, which is totally heart-wrenching, particularly when I think of the fact that he would give lessons, right, to kids all week long. And how was that for him to see all these children who were alive and happy and thriving, and he had lost his only child? And the horrible thing is that I don't remember my mother saying to me, Nancy, say something nice to Sam, or we should do something nice for Mr. Gorski, or any of that, which she normally would, because I had a very thoughtful set of parents. But um, I don't remember. I don't remember ever saying anything to him about it. I feel
You
bad.
know, and of course, your parents aren't here to talk to them about it now, but maybe in some way they felt as though by not talking about it, that memory for a little 6-year-old girl might not be as vivid as it is now, 80 years later.
Yeah, could be.
So when we and I think that some of the folks who are on this call know this, but there were 160, at least 168 people were killed that day. Hundreds more were injured. The Ringling Circus was able to get back on the road, actually, because the city of Hartford and those who had claims against the circus knew that in order for them to collect on those claims, the circus had to be making money. So they entered into an agreement. A lot of the attorneys there in Hartford entered into this agreement, which for 10 years, those victims, about 600 people, had filed claims against the Ringling Circus to the tune of about $5 million. And they were all paid off, in part because of the movie The Greatest Show on Earth from 1951, which helped
Well,
kind of bring some money into the treasury and allowed that payoff in 10 years. So
may
the
may
circus,
I
yes.
may I ask you a question? I have never been able to understand in doing my own research if indeed there were in attendance 5 to 7,000, let's just say 6,000 people there, and 168 died. Where were 5,000 people exiting that tent in what, 10 minutes? I cannot understand this. Maybe you can help.
Well, I mean, I think that part of it is, and you were there, although there was a certain amount of panic that was involved, there were people who were true heroes, whether they were ushers. There were a number of servicemen who were in the audience that day. And one of the things that people forget about is that even though you come in through the entrance of the circus and there were some exits, you can pretty much leave anywhere if you go under the sidewall, even if it's staked out. A couple of people I know. One of the stories that came out of the fire was that there were a couple of people who later became relatively famous in the world of entertainment. One of them is the lady who's on the left here, and her name is Jan Miner. She was Madge on the Palmolive dishwashing detergent show. And she was actually working at WTIC in 1944 as a radio reporter. She had taken a group of 16 children to the circus that day with some teachers, and she had actually left a moment before the fire broke out because she had to get back to her radio show. Charles Nelson Riley, who a lot of you might remember from his days on the Hollywood Squares, he is also someone who was there that day. And in a one-man show that he did called The Life of Riley, he described the tragedy of watching what had happened. And I think he was a little older than you are. So, it was much more resonated with him what had happened that day and the friends that he went to school with and so forth. But anyway, so to answer your question, yeah, there were thousands of people in the Big Top that day. There was a lot of heroics. As we know, there was an animal shoot where both Joseph Walsh and May Kovar had their animals going through those animal chutes, and that animal chute was about 4 feet high and about 4 feet wide. And while there were steps that went over it, the steps were only about 6 feet wide. So children, of course, could not get over that animal chute, and a lot of those bodies were found there.
So when you're talking about heroics, I think this is the opportunity to speak about the two men from New London who were members of Circus Fans of America, who went to the circus that day, and who later, after the circus, there we are. Okay, so there's my aunt in the middle, and looking directly on, there are the two guys, Mr. Prentice and Mr. Nissen, on either side flanking her. And then the two taller children are on the right, my brother Mitchell Savin, my cousin Ruth Savin. There's me in front of one, and my cousin Henry. This apparently was taken after the fire. But the reason why my aunt sort of staged this photo was that she was very grateful to them. They, as members of Circus Fans of America, as I understood it or have come to understand it, that their mantra was, if you go to the circus, it was their responsibility to be there in case something went wrong, to help out. And so I had this picture, and when I said to Mr. Hawley, when I got in touch with him, I said, I have read Michael Skidgel's book, I've read Stuart Onan's book, I've read all over nobody mentioned Circus Fans of America. So it was a mystery. I went online and I found on eBay an old application form, which you can show, because they were a viable organization. I don't know how large they were, but they I think had members all over the country, right, or wherever there might be.
Absolutely, all over the world, actually.
Okay.
There's an application from that era that I think you now own.
And there you see, there's Mr. Gil Conlon, who lived in Hartford, and it was $5 if you wanted to join. But they were members from New London. They went, and as I said, there was no word at all anywhere about that. And had they been there? Well, my aunt thought they had been there, but nobody else thought they had been there. So Bruce Hawley, the sleuth of sleuths, got in touch with a man. What was his name, Bruce? I can't remember.
Pete Adams.
Peter Adams.
In Florida, who happened to have your publication White Tops, but pre-digitized, the one that never got digitized. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he happened to have the July 1944 issue. And in that issue, a man by the name of Robert Ensworth, wrote an article about the circus fire and included those two names, proving that they had been there and that they had been helpful and that they had helped let the you could maybe go under the sidewall, but they helped drop the sidewalls of the circus tent. So it's another little piece of history that Mr. Hawley and I have added to the circus fire.
And if you have a chance to ever see that issue of the White Tops, Robert Ensworth's article is very interesting because he was a soldier who was at home on leave, and he just happened to be going to the circus, and he wrote an excellent account of what happened that day. And perhaps even the Circus Historical Society will have the opportunity to maybe republish that at some point.
I think that's a great idea. You should definitely.
Yeah. So Nancy, we talk about the tent and so forth. I'm going to put up a drawing here of the Big Top on July the 6th, 1944. So the entrance, which is seen here on the left, and if you've been to the site there in Hartford, think of it as being, we're looking to the north, but if it was flipped around the other way, so that entrance actually faces towards what is now the school there on Barber Street. That would have been how you came in. Where were you sitting?
Okay, so I cannot, and I tell you, I don't have any memory of getting to our seats, but I know where we were because I know where the fire started, and I know that everyone was looking towards the fire. So if you look at this diagram, and on the far right top, you see general admission, then you see the bandstand.
Above the bandstand, yes.
We were north. We were in that general admission, so we just popped out the back. We weren't in the reserve seats; those were too expensive. We were just in the general admission. Thank you, Auntie. Okay.
But if you take a look at this, and again, a lot of the people who are on this call do have some knowledge about the fire itself. The origin of the fire is believed to be over in the lower left hand. You can see where it says origin of fire. The wind was blowing in that sort of northeasterly direction. So that was one of the reasons why the tent, which of course was treated with this, thousands of gallons of gasoline and paraffin, caught fire as quickly as it did and basically evaporated, as some people on the site said. You were at the other end. You were in that general admission diagonally across from where the fire started.
Right.
You can see that there were two animal chutes there. This was at a time when they did not use transfer cages. They used these animal chutes. You can actually see the cage wagons at the very top of the diagram there. Unfortunately, it was there that most of the victims were found after the fire because they could not get over those animal chutes. They said had it happened 10 minutes later, the animal chutes wouldn't have been there. Had it happened even later, it might have happened during the Pantos Paradise spec. So You know, we obviously can only imagine what might have happened if the fire would have broken out later than it did, which was really about 10 minutes into the performance, right, Nancy?
That's what I understand. So yes, that's exactly where we were. And Bruce had a photograph. Well, this is an interesting photograph, just for an aside, where you see that the sidewall has been lowered, but that was apparently for air conditioning.
It's
That
very
was
hot that day.
they're not down. And that's what I don't understand, is why we see the lowered but not down to the ground. So I can't account for this photograph, because as I understand it, when I jumped there, when I jumped, I slid down. There was no sidewall, that I remember. There was just the ropes going down. There was no sidewall, at least where I was in my part.
You know, I mentioned earlier when we were talking about some of the others who were there, including the actress Jan Miner, who later went on to become famous as the manicurist in those Palmolive commercials. She had taken this group of 16 children to the circus. One of those kids who was with her is one that story has been told that he wanted to take his Boy Scout knife with him, and his mother wouldn't let him do it, but he took it anyway. And fortunately, he was able to get down and use that knife to slice open the sidewall and allow many people out of the tent from where they were sitting too.
Yeah.
So you know, that was just one of those another one of those events where people were probably saved because of the quick thinking of that child. You know, when you look back on the past 80 years, basically, since that afternoon in July 1944, there was a period of time, as you told us, where this was not something that was top of mind. But as you've gotten a little older and kind of maybe understood the historical aspect of this, when did you sort of start becoming really interested in the Hartford Fire?
Yeah, well, after writing my essay,
Can you read that for us? I think that would be
I
excellent.
can. Or you don't want me to read the whole thing, do
Well,
you?
I don't know. I think it sounds, this was written about 3 years after the fire, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, at 6 years old, you can't write. You
Right.
learn to write when you're like 8 and 9, and this looks even better than so. And so I would say it was maybe 4 to 5 years. Anyhow, my teacher said it was very good. She didn't even give me an A. She just said, and I called it Big Blaze.
So
So
you're about 9 years old when you wrote this.
I think, yeah. So okay. I mean, I guess I'll read it all. And if you get bored, let me.
No, please do.
Okay. Okay. When we got to Hartford and to that certain street, we saw it, the circus. My goodness. So many people. We got there in the show was about to start, and we saw lions and bears and many animals doing tricks. After a half hour or so, it's not correct, it was more like 10 minutes, I guess. It seemed that everyone started looking towards the end of the tent. I thought that they were looking to see the acrobats. Then someone shouted, "Fire!" I was little and I didn't think much of it. I didn't even know what was happening. Then my aunt took my hand and led me to the top. There was a rope extending 15 feet to the ground with a man at the bottom catching those who shimmied down. He didn't look very nice, so I didn't want to go. But my aunt pushed me, and I went down and got a terrific rope bird. My aunt jumped down on high heels, but she landed safely. And all were there except for one, and that was her nephew, Eddie. He was sitting up, uh, afraid to jump. And so one of the clowns pushed him and he landed but hurt his back. We all started away. And as I looked back, I saw the top of the tent in a blaze. I also saw one girl looking for her mother, and I'll never forget the expression on her face. And one man was carrying a girl badly burned. A few days after the fire, I learned that my cousin had, I don't know, wounded his spine or something. And many, many years later, he was, I'm
Here you
sorry,
go. Well, yeah, obviously, you're very talented as a 9-year-old writing too.
I don't think so.
One of the things we talked a little bit about WTIC radio. This is a radio station that's still a very popular station in Hartford. It was owned by the Travelers Insurance Company at one point, TIC,
Yes.
and they among radio stations, they have been able to maintain an archives that is among the best in really radio in the United States.
Wow.
They recorded some of the broadcasts that day, and they recently rebroadcast it as part of their 100-year anniversary of the radio station. The station is owned by a company called Audacy Communications now, big radio company. And through our friends there, we were able to get some of that audio. And I'm going to actually join this sort of in progress because they're talking a little bit about some of the other things that happened in July of 1944. But you're going to hear reporting that was done, radio reporting that was actually done on the day of the Hartford fire. Very, very unusual to hear this type of a broadcast, but let's give it a shot, see if we can make this happen here.
Hundreds of central Connecticut men, women, and children were breathlessly enjoying the excitement of Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus under the big tent in Hartford on July 6th, when suddenly the faces of smiling, excited circus fans turned to masks of panic. Bernard Mullins and George Bow were at the scene of the Holocaust.
Hello, everyone. Well, Hartford this afternoon suffered one of the greatest catastrophes in its history, when during a matinee performance of Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus, the big tent suddenly burst into flame and burned to the ground, causing more than 100 deaths and unestimated casualties. WTIC's George Bow and myself were on the grounds within a few minutes after the conflagration had leveled the big show, and while smoke was still rising from the horrible mass of canvas and poles and bleachers.
That's right, Bernard. According to eyewitnesses at the scene, the fire started at about 2:33 after the show had been underway a quarter of an hour, and we were on the grounds about 3 o'clock. Bernard, what was that story that the woman survivor told you there?
Well, she was a lady from Meriden, George, attending the show with her 6-year-old son. Fortunately, they were seated near an exit at the far end of the tent and managed to escape. Her little boy was seated directly in front of her in the 6th row. The first indication of anything wrong came when the cry of fire was heard, and immediately a wisp of smoke came from the side wall near the front entrance. This lady pushed her youngster off the seat, and as he landed on the ground, she told him not to rush, but to keep going toward that exit. They were among the first dozen or so out.
Yes, and that wisp of smoke developed in a matter of seconds into a blazing inferno. In fact, in 2.5 minutes, the entire tent was enveloped in flames and had collapsed. An eyewitness in an office across the street told us that it appeared almost like spontaneous combustion, so quickly was the big tent a mass of flame.
Quoting from Francis Chase's book, Sound and Fury.
Needless to say, regular programs were canceled as the entire staff devoted itself to the task of spiking wild rumors, passing on accurate information, and reassuring families throughout the community.
So when you look back on those days, Nancy, obviously you were eyewitness to history. How do you think that people will remember the Hartford Circus fire now that 80 years later? I mean, we still have a lot of interest in it.
No. I would love to know how many survivors there are. I don't know how I would find that out. I know that Michael Skidgel has a great website.
Yes, he does. Circusfire1944.com, Michael Skidgel. It has video. It has a lot of diaries and things like that. I encourage everyone to go and check that out. Circusfire1944.
It has survivor stories. Doesn't have my story. I didn't even know about it. I haven't, I didn't start to research it until just, a few months ago. It's very humbling to think that, I'm a part of this horrific story. I'm angered but that the city of Hartford was so lax, but understandably, you need a catastrophe like this to prod them, right? To make the government work in a way, maybe they just, I don't know, I can't explain it. That makes me very angry, I have to say. But I don't know, I don't have anything very profound to say about it. There are tragedies in this lifetime that we all are aware of, and we continue to be aware of.
Fire, of course, was always something that the circus was concerned about. And although there had been circus tent fires in the United States prior to that, this was, of course, the most disastrous, one of the most disastrous fires in American history.
Ringling had fires before, right?
Yes.
There were folks.
And in 1981, of course, in India, in Bangalore, India, there was a pretty serious fire that killed nearly 100 people at a circus. But it is a historic event. I very much appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective and recollections, Nancy. It was 80 years ago today. There aren't that many people around who can still have those vivid memories, and the fact that you've shared them with us tonight on Circus History Live is a real treasure for all of us.
Well, I'm
You've been
grateful to you. You did
you
a
have-
wonderful
Go ahead.
presentation. No, I think your presentation was just wonderful. And
Well, thank you.
okay.
But anyway, you've been watching Circus History Live. This is our monthly opportunity to get together and talk about issues of circus history from yesterday and today. Our guest tonight has been Nancy Savin. She was a survivor of the Hartford Circus fire, which happened 80 years ago this month. Nancy, thank you again for sharing your recollections. Bruce?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Nancy, for coming on. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Anya Norris, who will be doing the editing and putting the recording of this program on the Circus Historical Society YouTube channel, probably tomorrow afternoon. As I mentioned at the beginning, the CHS started this series during the pandemic. We've done, I don't know, I think 40 or 50 of these programs already, which is amazing. All kinds of topics, all kinds of guest speakers. And fortunately, we recorded them all. So please go to the CHS YouTube channel to learn about many of these topics. If you're not already a member of the CHS, I encourage you to join. Nancy joined. And we get, for $60 a year, we get our quarterly journal, The Bandwagon, which, by the way, the current issue is in the mail as we speak. So those of you who are members should be getting it shortly. We got a report this morning that some people already got them yesterday, actually. So, and this particular issue is the second part of Chris Berry's article about the Madison Square Garden, history of Madison Square Garden, but there are other wonderful articles in there as well. And it's, again, a fascinating organization, been around since 1939. So with that, I have nothing else to add except to thank you for tuning in to CHS. And again, thank you, Nancy, for coming on. It was wonderful. And Chris, any other parting comments before we go?
Just wanted to remind people that Bandwagon Magazine is available on the Internet Archives. And in 2019, which it's hard to believe has been 5 years ago now, we did a complete issue on the 75th anniversary of the Hartford fire. And there are quite a few stories in there. Again, those who were eyewitnesses to the event, getting the circus back on the road after the fire for the Blue Sky tour that ensued, and also photographs of many of the artifacts from the fire. So, and also a piece on circus disaster music. So I encourage you to go to Internet Archives, do a search for Bandwagon Hartford Circus Fire, and you'll be able to read that also.
Great. Well, good night, everyone, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you.